Hey class, welcome to week 15. I hope that you and yours are staying safe and well. This week we are going to take a more global perspective while examining climate change and its impacts, including impacts on emergency management and response. Today we're going to cover a lot of what our textbook covered in this week's assigned reading, but we're also going to go beyond that. So we're going to start out talking about ozone depletion and then move into a discussion of climate change. We're going to talk about the science of climate change, its impacts on society, its impacts on emergency management, some of the legal responses to climate change, and then how we can effectively address climate skepticism. So beginning in the late 1970s, research started to show that chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, could harm the ozone in our atmosphere. But the public didn't pay much attention to this until British scientists discovered what came to be called the ozone hole over Antarctica in 1985. And this discovery came as a real shock to many scientists because their research at the time had forecasted that there would be a decline in polar ozone levels, but the depletion over the Antarctic region was far, far worse than anybody anticipated. And additionally, this ozone hole, it was over an area of the globe that did not produce and did not use CFCs. At the time, scientists had assumed that CFCs in the atmosphere were going to be most prevalent in those areas where they were manufactured or used regularly. So starting with the discovery of the ozone depletion over Antarctica, scientists realized that CFCs, they mix and spread globally throughout the atmosphere. And there's no actual hole in the ozone, it's not like a donut with a hole in the middle. It's really a depletion in ozone levels. The public latched onto the concept of the ozone hole and started to clamor for governments to fix the issue. Particularly as the media began linking CFCs to the ozone layer and reported on possible increases in skin cancers and other health problems related to ozone depletion. As a kid, I remember there was intense public worry about the ozone hole. It was pretty much constantly on the news, local news as well. And so public outcry led to what we would now consider to be a shockingly speedy and cooperative intergovernmental race to find a solution. Only 2 years later, so 2 years after that 1985 discovery of the ozone hole, basically the whole world showed up in 1987 for the Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer. And the Vienna Convention recognized that science hadn't caught up yet to what was happening with the ozone layer. So rather than forcing reduction levels, the convention established an international mechanism for research, for monitoring, and crucially for the intergovernmental exchange of information. So this was not, siloed. All the governments of the world were cooperating. And while it was non-binding, because there wasn't yet enough scientific evidence to make binding decisions, the Vienna Convention is considered to be one of the most successful treaties of all time. It was ratified by 197 states, so all 195 UN members, plus the Vatican, the new islands, the Cook Islands, plus the European Union as a whole, and also the European Union states individually. So as an aside, there are currently 193 UN member states plus 2 non-member states, which are the Vatican, which is an independent nation, and the Palestinian Authority. So you can really see, that the whole world came together to address this global problem of ozone depletion. It was something that affected all of humanity. It didn't matter where you lived, the color of your skin, or your ideology. It affected everybody equally, and so the world came together to address that problem. And the public demand didn't just motivate state actors. Public pressure on industry started a search for solutions. And that search was headed up by chemical giant DuPont, which at the time was actually producing a significant chunk of the world's CFCs. So research and development is notoriously expensive, but so is losing your whole customer base. And as a result, the chemical industry and the industries that depend on CFCs began doing something pretty unusual. They began actually asking the US federal government and other governments to impose regulations that would restrict CFCs. So the governments responded, and by 1989, the Montreal Protocol on substances that delete the ozone was in force. So that Montreal Protocol froze CFC production and consumption levels, and it created a binding reduction schedule for CFCs and also for halons, which also deplete the ozone. So the protocol recognized that not all countries were going to be able to react to this ozone problem in the same way. So it created a basket of solutions that would allow countries to achieve their reduction rates by regulating different types of CFCs. So that was smart because it avoided a protracted negotiation over which CFCs to eliminate first, and it provided industry with the push that it had asked for to start investing in researching CFC alternatives, as well as mechanisms for capturing and recycling CFCs that are used in the industrial process. So to incentivize countries to join the protocol, and to make sure that there was no free rider program where countries that didn't join could reap the benefits, the Montreal Protocol imposed some pretty tough trade measures. Basically, those measures banned the import and export of CFCs and products produced with CFCs to non-party countries. Although basically every country signed on, so there were not a whole lot of non-party countries, but even so, this trade mechanism, these trade measures, really helped accelerate the search for a different alternative that would not harm the ozone. So the Montreal Protocol was very forward-thinking in that it addressed environmental justice considerations, even though we didn't really use the term environmental justice at that time. And it also recognized that over the years, science was going to change. So by addressing environmental justice, the protocol recognized that the world's richest countries were most directly responsible for the problem of the ozone hole in the first place, and it would be unfair to require developing countries to completely abstain from using CFCs because at the time, products containing CFCs were fairly critical to improving quality of life in both developed and developing countries. So the protocol basically said, okay, developed nations, you're going to provide financial aid as well as technical assistance to these developing countries. And the protocol established a multilateral fund to pay for any unexpected costs that came out, that came up while developing countries in particular were phasing out CFCs. From a scientific perspective, the Montreal Protocol was designed so that it could be altered and refined over time as our scientific knowledge increased and as our technologies improved. And the protocol specifically welcomed developing nations into the scientific community. Protocol parties actually still meet regularly to further tighten reduction schedules and to implement controls for new chemicals. So the Montreal Protocol is considered to be extremely successful, and overall it has been. It was the first global treaty that achieved universal ratification. So for the first time ever, the entire world agreed that there was a problem, that it needed to be fixed, and agreed on how we're going to fix it. Not only have all countries ratified the Montreal Protocol, but every single country in the world is in compliance with it, which is frankly amazing. It was also the first treaty to provide for equal representation of developing nations, and it was the first treaty that created a truly democratic process of providing financial assistance to developing nations. So thanks to the Montreal Protocol, the world has phased out 98% of ozone-depleting substances in about 100 different hazardous chemicals. Now, unfortunately, the best intents can sometimes lead to new problems. Industry, particularly the refrigeration industry, so that's both home and commercial, replaced CFCs with hydrochlorofluorocarbons, HCFCs, and hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs. So at the time, companies like DuPont believed that these chemicals were actually safe because they were not causing ozone depletion. In January of 2018, NASA offered up the first direct proof that the ozone hole was recovering thanks to the Montreal Protocol's ban on CFCs. Specifically, NASA was able to determine that the level of chlorine caused by CFCs had dropped and that less ozone was being depleted. So less of it was being lost. The hole was not growing. Now, it is unfortunately not all good news. The ozone layer above the northern hemisphere has greatly improved, as has the health of the upper ozone layer, but we still have a lot of regular ozone depletion in our polar regions, especially in the southern hemisphere, and the lower ozone layer is still not as healthy as we would like. Now, fortunately, the Montreal Protocol remains in effect thanks to the 2018 Kigali Amendment, which entered into force on January 1st, 2019. The Kigali Amendment, which was ratified by 65 countries, requires all of those countries to gradually phase out their use of HFCs, which are used predominantly by the refrigeration industry and in commercial and home air conditioning. And the plan under the Kigali Amendment is to reduce those HFCs by 80% over the next 30 years. Some developed countries have already started phasing out HFCs, and all developing countries have agreed to freeze their HFC levels in 2024. And again, this is intended to give the developing world some time to catch up on quality of life advancements that we in the developed world have enjoyed for years or decades. So the Kigali Amendment, it includes agreements on technologies that are useful in destroying HFCs. It's got data reporting requirements on the progress of HFC phase-out, and it has provisions for assisting developing countries in reaching compliance. The Kigali Amendment, it has major public support in the US, especially, and this was a bit surprising to me, from the refrigerant industry. That's the industry that makes its money using HFCs, but the refrigerant industry wants a phase-out because it wants to operate with some certainty about how the regulatory scheme is going to be in the future. So if there's a phase-out plan, at least it knows how to change up its operations, to remain competitive. Another Kigali Amendment proponent is the business-focused and typically anti-regulation Chamber of Commerce. It has voiced support for the US to ratify the Kigali Amendment, and there's also a lot of public support for it. Now, most Americans don't recognize the name Kigali Amendment, but when the purpose is explained, we as a whole do tend to support it. Additionally, the Chamber of Commerce and the industrial sector recognize that it is in the US economy's long-term best interest to sign on to Kigali. But unfortunately, the Trump administration has thus far not done so. Basically, there's this feeling that it doesn't want to agree to anything that it considers to be related to climate change. Even without the US participation in the Kigali Amendment, which, who knows, we might sign on eventually, there are good lessons to be learned from the Montreal Protocol and from its amendment. So we have learned that to address a global problem, we really do need truly global cooperation. And to achieve full global cooperation, our treaties have to be fair to developing nations. And this means putting the majority of the burden on developed nations, which really should be fine because we are the ones who are responsible for the problem in the first place. We also learned that governments alone can't solve these global problems. We need the public, we need universities and research nonprofits, and we need industry R&D to get involved. The broader the data gathering, the better chances of reaching a scientific consensus. And we've learned that reaching that consensus is really important for getting industry to the table, especially if we can set clear timetables for compliance because business likes certainty. So even though the industry might not like particular regulations, they do appreciate the certainty that those regulations allow them to operate under. We also learned that a precautionary approach can work. I mean, there was obviously a problem with the ozone layer, but we didn't hem and haw and wait until we were in the midst of a complete full-blown crisis. We took action earlier. So the international community, we can address these global threats so long as there's some framework for organizing scientific input, taking into consideration differing economic interests, getting the public engaged, and what's really important is to have a forum for ongoing negotiations so that we can, as an international community, consistently refine the process. So the ozone level and climate change are often linked in the public mind. There is a link between the two, but we're going to address them somewhat differently. So Earth's climate has always changed. In fact, there was a warm period during the Middle Ages, and then that was followed by what we call the Little Ice Age. That was a period of cooling from the 16th to 19th centuries. And these changes, they happen due to natural occurrences. Volcanic eruptions, solar radiation actually comes at us in different cycles. Plus there are variations in the Earth's orbit and its axial tilt. So there are definitely non-human reasons why our climate changes over, thousands, millions, and billions of years. But humans have also contributed to climate change through our agricultural practices, deforestation, and industrialization. So we have seen an enormous increase in the human impact on the environment since the Industrial Revolution. As industrialization increased, so did pollution, including the emission of gases that trap heat and the emission of small particulate matter that interact with sunlight, also trapping heat. Both of these lead to an overall warming of the planet. Now, a lot of this human impact, although bad for the environment, has actually been really good for humanity. There's really no argument that industrialization has vastly improved the lives of billions of people. We would not be having this class, online, asynchronous class that you can take. We wouldn't have that without the benefits of industrialization. Unfortunately, we have also seen significant allegations of bad faith by industrial actors. Not even really allegations. We've actually seen this from industry's internal memos and their internal science. So we know, for instance, that Exxon was already factoring climate change into its business decisions back in 1981, but it was hiding that and hiding the science that it had done internally from the public and from the government. In 1995, an organization of fossil fuel companies actually commissioned an internal climate science assessment. And that was led by Mobil, the gas company, by their scientists. And we've got a leaked memo from that commission that states that, and I'm quoting here, human-caused global warming cannot be denied. So even though their own internal research showed that their emissions were responsible for this kind of planetary-wide damage, the fossil fuel companies really engaged in sort of disinformation campaigns. They wanted to muddy the waters on this topic and create a fake debate where there's actually a scientific consensus. And that disinformation campaign may still be going on. We have found internal documents that sort of reveal this fossil fuel industry deception. Some of those are from as recent as 2015. So yes, we know that human activity is driving climate change. We've actually known since 1896 the process by which greenhouse gas emissions warm the planet. So 1896, what else was happening? Grover Cleveland was president in 1896. Utah became a state in 1896. At the time, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, Alaska, and Hawaii had not joined the Union. Also, in 1896, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson, which upheld racial segregation, and it introduced the doctrine of separate but equal that was finally overturned by Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. So those were some of the things that were going on in 1896 when we first learned that greenhouse gas emissions could have a global warming impact. So that was a long time ago. And our scientific knowledge of Earth's climate has significantly improved since then. So researchers in government, university, and industry have collected and analyzed massive amounts of data that have really allowed for the formation of a global scientific consensus on climate change. So for instance, we have discovered that atmospheric CO2 reveals its source. So scientists can actually determine how much carbon dioxide in our atmosphere comes from natural sources versus how much comes from human activity. We have also been able to track greenhouse gases from a pre-industrial baseline. And we've learned, not surprisingly, that greenhouse gases have greatly increased since the start of our industrial era. Finally, we have both realized and validated the fact that natural changes alone simply don't account for what we are witnessing in the present time. I mean, we've got 1,000-year flood events that are occurring in quick succession, heat waves that are leaving thousands of people dead, intensifying storm systems and wildfires that are destroying whole towns. So there is a scientific debate over climate change, but it's a debate over very specific details. Where, when, how it affects human health. There is no scientific debate that climate change is occurring and that it's very bad for us as humans, and that we are quickly reaching, if we have not already reached, a point of no return when it's going to become impossible to fix the damage that we're done. So as I mentioned a couple slides back, there's no debate about climate change within the fossil fuel industry, even though that industry has fought pretty mightily against government regulation to mitigate climate change. There has been a fairly sudden change of heart amongst a lot of fossil fuel companies. Now a lot of them publicly agree with the scientific consensus that human activity is warming the planet. In part, so this change of heart has been induced by states' attorneys general, who have been targeting fossil fuel companies with lawsuits based on harm to the public, and I have to say, as an attorney more brilliantly, harm to shareholders. So a company like Exxon can claim that it doesn't have any duty to the public, and that, if you think back to our torts cases, might be true. At this point, they're on notice of the damage, so I don't think that they can really claim no duty, but let's say they can. They're claiming no duty to the public. But the people who make up the boards of directors of companies do have a legally recognized fiduciary duty to the company's shareholders. So what that means is, even if fossil fuel companies can screw over the public, they're not supposed to be screwing over their shareholders. There have been 9 recent lawsuits where cities have sued these companies over climate change. And while past lawsuits have actually fought about whether climate change exists and whether it's linked to human activity, in these more recent lawsuits, the science is not on trial. In one case, Chevron even put together a climate change tutorial for a judge, and in that tutorial, Chevron says, yeah, the science is correct. Climate change is really happening. Humans really are responsible. Even Exxon now backs a carbon tax, although this is not an entirely altruistic move. It's wanting to do this in exchange for immunity from climate change lawsuits. Now, to be clear, neither the tax nor the question of company immunity has been decided. Exxon is in a particularly vulnerable spot right now because the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear its appeal after the Massachusetts High Court ordered Exxon to turn over internal documents that discuss its knowledge about the impact of fossil fuels on the global climate. Additionally, Exxon's in a tight spot because as these internal memos have been leaked and more information about its particular disinformation campaign has come out, the EU is actually considering banning Exxon from all lobbying activities in the EU, which would be a big hit to Exxon. So the fossil fuel industry, they've not always admitted it publicly, but they do agree with the science. It's also important to realize that the impacts of climate change can actually be seen today. You can go and have a look for yourself. I have been to Alaska, I think 5 times over the past 20 years, and even on my earliest trip there, I could see that the glaciers were actively receding. So Exit Glacier is in Alaska's Kenai Fjords National Park. It's incredibly easily accessible. So I've actually climbed on it several times. This is in no way challenging. Don't think of me like with mountaineering gear and whatnot. You can just drive up and basically park right next to the glacier's terminus. And every time I've seen Exit Glacier, it has shrunk. And there are year markers there, so you can actually see how far the glacier spread when it, back in the day. So they've got like a marker for 1976. And when I was there in 2005, it was a pretty long walk from the current area where the glacier ends to where it used to end back in 76. And here you can see on the screen 2 other Alaskan glaciers. I've got Muir Glacier and Peterson Glacier, and how they've receded over the decades. The glaciers are not the only thing melting. The Arctic region is losing its permafrost to heat. So permafrost is ground that, as the name implies, remains frozen. So permafrost officially is ground that remains frozen for 2 or more consecutive years. And it is made up of regular ground stuff, rock, soil, sediments, but it also has ice that binds all of this together. And some permafrost has been frozen for hundreds of thousands of years. It can be 3 feet thick to almost 5,000 feet thick. So we're getting up to a mile. And permafrost stores carbon-based remains of plants and animals that died and then froze before they could decompose. And scientists estimate that if the permafrost were to melt, it would double the amount of carbon that is currently in our atmosphere. And that would be to put it mildly, a huge problem for us. But even without it melting away entirely, the permafrost melt has major consequences for humans. Ground that has always been frozen has now turned to muck. Highways are literally falling apart because the permafrost beneath them is melting. One of these highways, the Alaska Highway, is actually a critical artery for Canada and the US. That is melting away. Alaska's Department of Transportation sees thawing unstable permafrost as really the biggest problem that it faces. And there's not enough money to keep repairing roads because these roads simply buckle and collapse as the permafrost melts. And it's not just roads and highways. Buildings, including houses, are falling down because their foundations are built on permafrost, which has now melted. We estimate that we might lose 1/3 of all of the infrastructure in the Arctic. And that includes a lot of private homes, and that could directly impact about 4 million people. So if you don't live in the Arctic, you might think, well, melting permafrost, not a big deal. Well, as it turns out, it might actually directly affect all of humanity, because as permafrost melts, it exposes bacteria and viruses that have been frozen and inert for hundreds of thousands of years. It's not hundreds of thousands of years old, but you can see that bottom right photo. That's actually a bison that was trapped in the permafrost, and now you can see it as the permafrost is melting. In 2016, dozens of people were hospitalized and 1 young child died after contracting anthrax in Siberia because there was an anthrax-infected reindeer carcass that froze decades and decades earlier, It became exposed when the permafrost thawed, and the anthrax spores actually entered the soil and water and eventually made their way into the food supply, infecting humans. So we are not sure all that is lurking in the permafrost, but we do know that it can actually harm us. Another impact of Arctic and Antarctic melting is sea level rise. The Antarctic lost 40 billion tons of its ice each year from 1979 to 1989. We know now that that figure has risen to 252 billion tons lost annually. If we lose all of Antarctica, that actually contains 187 feet of potential sea level rise. There are huge swaths of human civilization that can't even handle a 2-foot sea level rise, certainly not a 187-foot one. And unfortunately, even the areas that are not impacted by sea level rise, and to be clear, the sea isn't going to rise uniformly across the planet, but even those areas that aren't in coastal regions, they're going to have to deal with the impacts related to sea level rise, like higher storm surges, more dangerous hurricanes, land loss, and a huge displacement of formerly coastal populations. So basically, we can be facing a worldwide refugee crisis that isn't caused by war, it's caused by the fact that we are literally going to lose land where humans have lived basically for, since the dawn of agriculture. So on this lecture slide, I've got photos of sea level rise affecting the Marshall Islands and also Greenland. So Greenland's below right. Picture of how much of Florida stands to be lost from even a minor sea level rise. And the result of a flash flood of historic proportions in Washington, D.C., which flooded our metro stations. So, I mean, you can see there's tons of standing water in the metro stations, basically a waterfall coming off of the metro escalators. Extreme heat has become increasingly common and will only intensify in the years to come. And extreme heat has serious implications for people, for communities, and for our infrastructure. And that's because heat on its own, without any exacerbating conditions, is a major killer. The European heat wave in 2003 killed around 60,000 people. And those European heat waves, they're becoming much more regular. It used to be one every 30 years. Now it's more like one every 2 or 3 years. Heat waves lead to thawing in the mountains, which contributes to rock slides and mudslides. And because heat dries out the underbrush, heat waves lead to forest fires. Those raged across Europe during that 2003 heat wave. Nearly 20 of the hottest years on record have occurred in the 21st century. And of course, we are 20 years into the 21st century. And extreme heat, it disrupts weather patterns. That creates stronger, more intense storms. According to NOAA, in 2018, there were 14 weather and climate events that cost the U.S. hundreds of lives and billions of dollars in damages. So in 2018 alone, 247 deaths, $91 billion in damages. So we're seeing the results of a changing, warming climate, and it's not good. We talked about this in a past lecture, but in California, 2018 Camp Fire, it was the worst wildfire in California history, 6th worst fire in U.S. history. Across the U.S., last 7 years have been the warmest ever recorded. Warmest on record ever since NOAA began tracking global heat about 140 years ago. And as we saw in Australia, the 2019-2020 bushfire season, it was the costliest natural disaster in Australian history. The cost was really unprecedented. Not only the economic cost, which was around $100 billion, but also the loss of human life, the decimation of species, and the loss of habitat. So the Australian infrastructure, were just torn up by these extreme weather events, and not just infrastructure, but also habitat. So I'm not sure how many species have been lost. But so this is extreme weather that is really impacting the globe. So it's not just Alaska and other polar regions that are experiencing roads destroyed by extreme weather events. During the historic 2013 flooding in Colorado, Colorado lost 50 state bridges and 200 miles of highway. There has been increased flooding in the Midwest that has caused so much damage to bridge supports that there's concern that many bridges are actually going to fall apart in the very near future, either due to just a lot of heavy traffic, so overloading, or even just high winds and heavy rains. California's Highway 1, which is the only access to Big Sur, which is a major tourist attraction, that was closed for 14 months because of massive mudslides. And it's not just water and mud and fire. Recently in the American Southwest, truckers and other motorists have died because these sudden dust storms come up and they result in massive traffic accidents because suddenly you can't see anything. And in Colorado, if you drive up I-25, particularly if you get north of Longmont, if there are strong winds, they blow trucks over. And it's expensive to replace these huge trucks, and getting blown over causes an immense amount of damage to them and to the contents that they're carrying. And the U.S. Department of Defense has long been concerned with the impact of climate change. There is a joint base Langley-Eustis in Virginia. It has experienced 14 inches in sea level rise since the mid-1900s. So the DoD has been saying for years that climate change is a national security issue. And in 2019, the DoD's official report again said that the currently changing climate brings with it major threats to the safety and security of our nation. So flooding, drought, desertification, wildfires, and thawing permafrost, these are all serious concerns for the DoD, which has actually invested in a research and development program specifically aimed at improving its understanding of environmental risks to DoD bases and to its overall mission. And the DoD's 2019 report also makes it clear that when it talks about the future, it doesn't mean some distant future that may or may not happen. It means no more than 20 years from now. It can take longer than 20 years to stop a trend once that trend develops. And what that means is 20 years in the future, that's not enough time for us to mitigate climate change. The changing climate is also a concern for risk managers and emergency response personnel. The challenges and the magnitudes of climate change-related hazards include the expansion of infectious diseases into new territories, particularly as insects expand their range further north thanks to a warming climate. Emergency managers also have to deal with more frequent, more intense storms, the debris that they leave, extensive heat waves that directly impact the public health, as well as damage to infrastructure and also damage to the social fabric that holds communities together. And so the EPA and FEMA now strongly suggest that state and local governments integrate climate change into their all-hazard management plans. The EPA especially has really been warning us to brace for the impact of climate change. In 2019, the EPA published guidance for basically planning for more natural disasters, and in particular, the debris that they generate. So once again, it's the pre-incident planning that's key. So all hazards management professionals have been creating these debris management plans for their most likely causes of debris. That could be settling ash from an eruption, washed out roads from a flood, massive mudslides from heavy rain, all sorts of different types of debris. And although it primarily focuses on how to respond to these various debris streams, the EPA report also repeatedly makes the link between climate change and the fact that we are experiencing more frequent, more severe weather events like storms, floods, and fires. So when the world took note of the ozone hole in the mid-1980s, it acted collaboratively to change these behaviors that were damaging the environment, and that resulted in actual positive change. Unfortunately, it has not been as easy to persuade the world to act on climate change, but we do continue to try. In 1988, the United Nations created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That was a group of over 2,000 scientists charged with assessing the scientific, technical, and economic bases of climate change policy. Then in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change set the stage for the Kyoto Protocol. So the goal of that 1992 framework was to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at whatever level was going to avoid dangerous human interference with our climate system. And in the meantime, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, it kept reporting. So the panel's 1995 report found that humans were having a negative impact on the climate. And its reports throughout the years consistently found stronger and stronger evidence of human impact on our planet. In 2013, the panel said that it was over 95% certain that it was human greenhouse gases that were warming the planet and creating this harm. And the panel also properly predicted what we're now seeing: excessively hot temperatures, a rise in the severity of storms, a rise in sea levels, a decrease in the availability of fresh water in coastal areas because seawater is adding salinity, spread of disease, and also the loss of biodiversity as species lose their habitats because of the changing climate. So the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that set the stage for the Kyoto Protocol, which was ratified in 1997, and it entered into force in February of 2005. Currently, there are 192 parties to the Kyoto Protocol. That protocol acknowledges that individual countries, of course, have different capabilities in combating climate change, and again, that developed nations are predominantly responsible for this whole mess. So it created 4 international trading mechanisms for developed and developing nations, and that includes, as the book said, emissions trading, joint implementation of reduction targets, so you can band together with another country to reduce your targets, sort of, collaboratively. You can jointly fulfill your reduction targets, and then it also established mechanisms for clean development. And the Kyoto Protocol's first commitment period was 2008 to 2012. And then in 2012, the Doha Amendment kicked off the second commitment period, which ends in 2020. So the amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, it also did establish legally binding emission reduction targets for 37 countries. Now, unfortunately, it only tackles a very small part, about 14% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is primarily because the US, which is a huge producer, never joined. And then Canada, Japan, New Zealand, and Russia have all dropped out in recent years. But after Kyoto, 192 countries met in Copenhagen in 2009 to start working on a post-Kyoto climate change regime that would start in 2021 when the second commitment period ends. And this Copenhagen Accord did have some bright spots. For example, it established a green climate fund to support projects, programs, and policies in developing nations. And the developed nations of the world pledged billions of dollars to support that fund. The Accord also endorsed a general continuation of the Kyoto Protocol's goals. So although the Copenhagen Accord recognized the global climate crisis, it didn't create any legally binding mechanisms for mitigating damage. So thus far, only the developed EU countries have agreed to binding reductions in their emissions of greenhouse gas. So while Copenhagen was not a great success, it does show that the world, we keep attempting to address climate change. So in 2016, again, all countries came together in Paris and crafted the Paris Climate Agreement. And the goal of the Paris Agreement is to keep global temperature rise to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we don't want the warming to increase to more than 2 degrees. That's Celsius. It's 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And the Paris Climate Agreement did create binding commitments by all parties to prepare, maintain, and communicate their plans to mitigate global warming. It does not force countries to set a specific target to be met at a specific date. And that is a bit unusual because while most treaties are top-down, the Paris Climate Agreement is bottom-up. It allows for voluntary targets to be determined by each different country, so it does not impose standards and targets and controls onto countries. It actually wants each country to determine their own, and it leaves a lot of room for consensus building. So although it doesn't have specific targets, the Paris Agreement does achieve some concrete goals. It created binding commitments to regularly communicate about climate change mitigation actions that countries are taking. It reaffirmed the obligation of developed countries to support the developing world. It encouraged voluntary participation by the developing world and provides financing to companies that lower their greenhouse gas emissions. And it encouraged parties to conserve and enhance what they call carbon sinks and carbon reservoirs, which are ecosystems that trap and store carbon, thus keeping it out of the atmosphere. The carbon sink idea actually features fairly heavily in the Paris Climate Agreement, and it basically amounts to letting countries plant trees to offset their carbon emissions, which does indeed sound like a good idea, although there was little scientific evidence at the time to support it. I mean, we know that overall trees are good, and that was pretty much that. Surprisingly, though, studies in 2013 and then again in 2017 found that the Amazon rainforest is actually emitting huge amounts of methane, which is a greenhouse gas. So a lot of forests are carbon sinks, but it's not a guarantee. Some forests are carbon emitters. And the fact that the Paris Climate Agreement doesn't have a binding enforcement mechanism is definitely problematic, as is the fact that no one has yet implemented policies to meet reduction goals. And actually, even if every party, every country achieved 100% compliance, at this point in time, it's unlikely that that would be enough to limit our global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. And the loss of the United States as a member to the agreement is another fairly substantial blow. In June of 2017, President Trump announced that he was going to withdraw the U.S. from the Paris Climate Agreement as soon as legally possible. Now, interestingly, that is just before the November 2020 presidential election, so I guess we will see what happens. So at the national level here in the U.S., the Clean Air Act pretty much remains our primary source of authority for the federal government to regulate greenhouse gases. So back in week 11, when we were talking about standing for plaintiffs in environmental cases, we discussed Massachusetts versus EPA, which was a 2007 U.S. Supreme Court case. So in that case, the EPA, under the George W. Bush administration, had claimed that the Clean Air Act did not give it the authority to regulate greenhouse gases. In response to a lawsuit by the state of Massachusetts, amongst other states and parties, the Supreme Court held that the EPA is in fact required to regulate greenhouse gas emissions if it determines that those emissions endanger the public health. And the Supreme Court required the EPA to actually make that determination and to determine if greenhouse gas emissions contribute to climate change. So under the Obama administration, the EPA went ahead and it issued an endangerment finding, saying yes, greenhouse gases are a threat to public health, and yes, they contribute to climate change. So the Obama administration EPA moved ahead, but the Clean Air Act really is not well suited to addressing the challenges of climate change. So as we've learned, the Clean Air Act focuses on having states address their own air quality in their own airsheds. So basically under the Clean Air Act, states are supposed to improve the quality of the air directly above them. But greenhouse gases mix and they spread so easily around the entire globe that there's really no effective way for states to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, just in their jurisdiction. Additionally, the EPA lacks the resources to enforce some of the statutory language of the Clean Air Act when it comes to greenhouse gases. So if you read the Act, it calls for the regulation of stationary facilities, so things like power plants and factories, that emit 250 tons or more of emissions per year. But practically, the EPA cannot even regulate stationary facilities that emit 25,000 tons of emissions per year. And that's what the EPA proposed. So, think about this. Congress told the EPA, you have to regulate at 250 tons of emissions annually. And the EPA said, nah, why don't we regulate at 25,000 tons nationally? So from an administrative law perspective, the EPA is simply wrong. It cannot do that. Congress created a 250-ton sandbox. That's where the EPA has to play. The EPA is not allowed to build a 25,000-ton sandbox. So from an administrative law perspective, what the EPA is doing here is wrong. But from a political standpoint, I'm honestly not sure that anybody in power cares enough to make the EPA regulate at that 250 tons of emission per year level. Now, this is not to say that the US is entirely without climate change policy. The US Global Change Research Program, which is required by the Global Change Research Act of 1990, requires reports to Congress every 4 years about the environmental, economic, health, and safety consequences of climate change. So we actually had a lot more public agreement on this back in the 90s. The National Climate Change Assessment is part of this program. It is an interagency as well as a government and non-governmental effort. So it is led by NOAA. That's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It includes the USDA, the Department of Commerce, which doesn't do a whole lot of actual commerce, but it collects an enormous amount of data for the US government. It includes the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Health and Human Services, Interior, State Department, Department of Transportation, the EPA, NASA, the National Science Foundation, the Smithsonian Institutes, because they are more than just museums, they're actually huge research centers. It also includes USAID, which operates international programs, and it includes members of industry. So this National Climate Change Assessment Group has issued thus far 4 assessments, the most recent being the 4th NCA, that's National Climate Assessment, which was issued in 2 pieces in 2017 and 2018. And this 4th assessment found that climate change will, and I'm quoting here, substantially damage the US economy, human health, and the environment with annual losses, expected to be in the range of hundreds of billions with a B dollars. And until recently, the National Climate Assessments also had a 15-person federal advisory committee that basically translated these reports into actionable policy advice for states, municipalities, and the private sector. And this committee had a surprisingly diverse membership, basically reflected communications, education, risk management, economics, social science, hard science, and technological perspectives. So it had people with all of these different perspectives. It also represented the gender and ethnic diversity of the US as a whole. So this was a really useful committee. Unfortunately, Trump dissolved the committee in August of 2017. He allowed its charter to expire. And then in late 2018, the Trump administration basically just dismissed the entire fourth climate change assessment, so that it was inaccurate. And the administration made sure that it was released on the Friday after Thanksgiving, Black Friday, basically a time when nobody is paying attention. So while the White House might dismiss these national climate assessments, the Climate Science Special Report, that's what makes up Volume 1 of the fourth assessment, it's specifically designed to be the authoritative assessment of the science of climate change in the United States. It is the result of 1,000 people working together. It's got 300 scientists, half from government, half from the private sector. So the executive branch is dismissing this, but hopefully the other branches of government, industry, and the public will pay attention. So state and local governments have really stepped up as the federal government has ignored these issues that we now face because of a warming planet. So in January of 2018, after Trump had dismissed that 15-person advisory committee for climate change assessment, a group of states, led by the state of New York, actually reconvened their own version of that committee. It's not going to be as good as the federal version, simply because the federal government does a better job at organizing nationally, but the states are trying. In addition, 400 different mayors, calling themselves climate mayors, have recognized the dangers that are posed by climate change, and they've made specific commitments to making water and air quality improvements, to investing in solar and wind energy, and investing in infrastructure for instance, bikes and public transit. States and cities have also continued to bring lawsuits in an attempt to address climate change. Some of those we have discussed in previous classes. About half the states, plus Washington, D.C., have all adopted voluntary emission reduction targets. California passed really strict vehicle emission standards way back in 2002, and the California standard has since been adopted by 12 or so other states, all of which require significant vehicle emission reductions by 2020. Additionally, states have been focusing on renewable energy in an attempt to reduce emissions from electricity generation, because that's a major source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US, is actually our power plants. And states have banded together by region to create carbon cap and trade schemes with a commitment of a 10% reduction in carbon dioxide from electric utilities by the end of this year. Another good thing about this state and local action is that states and cities are really starting to recognize the environmental justice aspects of climate change. The Cleveland Climate Action Plan, like many city plans adopted in recent years, was created with extensive public input from all citizens, regardless of race, regardless of socioeconomic status, or which neighborhood they lived in. And it specifically recognizes that poor and minority residents are more likely to live in areas that have less green space, so they're more likely to suffer from heat-related and respiratory illnesses. They're more likely to be impacted by extreme weather events, in part because of less access to information and less access to services. And poor and minority residents also spend a disproportionate amount of their income on energy costs. They spend about 13% on energy costs compared to about 3% in households that are not low-income households. And state and local governments have recognized that there are actual benefits to taking action to mitigate climate change. And some of those benefits include local green job creation, at a time when we are losing a lot of manufacturing jobs, to have jobs created at the local level that have to stay local for green energy. That's a big boon to state and local communities. Other benefits would be reduced costs for homeowners, better air quality, and just an overall improved public health, which is all good for people, good for the planet, and it also saves a lot of money for state and local governments. Now, in order to make progress on climate change, governments at all levels are going to have to address climate skeptics, as are people like us who are taking these environmental law classes, who work in environmental law, all hazards management. Those of us who actually see the effects of climate change and understand the impact, both economically and then just on our communities. Because right now, particularly in the US, we have a small but powerful minority of people who are really standing in the way of being able to effectively mitigate these harmful effects of a warming planet. And experts in risk communication, and you might remember risk communication from that, like barbers and hairstylists against HIV, they have set forth some practical guidelines for engaging with climate skeptics. First, although probably most challenging, is to remove politics from the discussion. The phrases global warming and climate change, these are scientifically accurate phrases, but they have taken on heavy political meaning. The moment those phrases get uttered, people's minds snap shut. Now, as this lecture shows, it's nearly impossible to avoid using those phrases when discussing the phenomenon of a warming planet, which is why I say that, it's all good and well to say take the politics out of it, don't use those phrases, but that's going to be pretty challenging. But even so, we need to move beyond the argument as to whether human activity causes climate change. It does, but that also really doesn't matter at this point. We need to address the problem no matter what its cause. Much like, we would have to address an incoming asteroid that was poised to strike Earth. Even though nobody on Earth created the situation, it's got to be addressed. Otherwise, we're all going to suffer. So one thing that risk communication experts recommend is to focus on what's happening locally and how unusual it is. And this is where local meteorologists, your friendly local TV weatherman or weatherwoman, they can help. Now, historically, local meteorologists have been really loath to address climate change. They don't want to lose their local news audience because of political reasons. But people generally trust their local weatherman. And so these meteorologists have started to explain weather-related events in their communities in the context of how much more these events are happening now than they did in the past. So in Baltimore, for example, local TV meteorologists have noted that Ellicott City, which is a historic town close to Baltimore, it has had 2 back-to-back 500-year flood events. So these are flood events that are only supposed to happen once every 500 years. They have happened twice in 2 years. So this focus on local happenings, and it doesn't even have to be disasters. I mean, it could be like spring comes earlier, our allergies are lasting longer. It's really hot in the summer and that's disrupting family vacations and other plans. Focusing on the local community also allows people to focus on the cost to the local community. Is the family farm still going to be here in 30 years? Are the kids going to inherit the beach house, or will it be swept away in a hurricane or lost to sea level rise? Another approach that experts suggest is to appeal to sort of stewardship of the earth feelings. A lot of climate skeptics enjoy things like hunting and fishing, and hunters and those who fish do tend to feel a connection with nature and feel the need to, kind of be stewards of the earth. Additionally, many religious people of all different faiths believe that humans were entrusted with protecting the earth. So why not play that up? And these approaches, they can all be taken together or separately. Another strategy is to instill a sense of urgency in local communities. And this is exactly what happened with the ozone hole in the mid-1980s. I mean, literally the whole world came together to mitigate the danger. So for climate change, at least here in the US, it might be possible to instill that sense of urgency by piggybacking on the Pentagon's urgent concerns about climate change. And that might be a especially good way to handle this because both sides of the political spectrum generally have a decent amount of trust in the US military. And finally, we should have policies that focus on rewarding people, not punishing them. Make clean energy cheaper rather than making fossil fuels prohibitively expensive. Provide job programs for the transition to wind or to solar power. Don't just lay off thousands of coal miners, ready them for clean energy jobs. And this doesn't have to be done in any type of condescending manner. Doctors, lawyers, and other professionals, we all engage in continuing education in our fields, so why shouldn't people in the energy sector? So these are all ways that we can interact with climate skeptics and hopefully bring them on board so that, much like with the worldwide mitigation of ozone depletion, we can come together as a world to mitigate the harmful effects of climate change. All right, that is it for this week. Thanks so much for sticking with me for the lecture. You do have a discussion due this week, but I am turning the tables. It's going to be your turn to ask a discussion question. I want each of you to post a question about some type of global issue that relates to environmental law and or all hazards management. So post that question. If you've got a response to your own question, please go ahead and respond. Otherwise, let us know, hey, I don't have a response to this. I'd like to hear from my classmates. In addition to posting a question, please also respond to at least one of your classmates' questions. So that's discussion 9, due by the end of this week. So thank you. I will see you on the discussion boards.